Many of you know the name Wayne Hoffman simply because of his newspaper column. He is what I would call a government watchdog, president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And over the weekend, he had a post. If some of you may have already seen this, it was online. And I happened to catch it, I think, Saturday on Facebook, where he was critical of the orders that came down from the governor late last week, which put a lot of restrictions on daily life in Idaho. Coming up on 5 minutes after 9 o'clock, we're at 38. Bill Cully on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And Mr. Hoffman, welcome to our show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've read your work for a long time. I think this might be the first time you've been on the air with us.
Oh, maybe so.
Yeah. I know that I get lots of comments about you from Republicans in southern Idaho. We can print them, but sometimes I think that they feel when they see you coming, they'd like to go hide under a desk.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I hope no one's just hiding under a desk. That would be unproductive.
Well, I think it's a good sign that you're effective with what you do. And I was reading your piece over the weekend, and I got the impression that you're looking at this and saying the governor is wrong on two counts, both federal and state constitution. Is that a good summation?
It's a start. I mean, there's way more to this, obviously, and I guess we can get into some of the topics. But if you read the governor's order and then you read what the attorney general says about the order, in fact, there's a fact sheet on the attorney general's website, and the first question is, does the governor have the power to do this? And the attorney general concludes, by golly, yes, he does. According to the state constitution, he's the supreme commander of the state, and he controls the state militia. And those are the reasons why the attorney general says the governor has these powers. But in order to give credence to that, you would have to completely disregard all the other things in the state constitution: freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, the ability of people to secure their own prosperity, and so on. And I don't understand how the state constitution can say, yep, he has all these powers, but then disregard all the various natural rights that humans have that are protected by the Constitution and say, oh, those don't count in this particular instance because it's an emergency after all.
I was going to say, I read through his orders, and to me it almost sounded as if he was asking for, to some degree, voluntary cooperation. Comment I heard earlier today was they're somewhat vague in many instances, that when you read through it. So perhaps the idea is just the office of the governor will get people to respond and do what the governor would like, but push comes to shove. No one's being dragged out of their cars because they're traveling in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Well, maybe not this moment they're not, but to be clear, what the order says is that under state law, if you violate the order, then you're subject to misdemeanor criminal sanctions and possible fines and jail time. That's not something that Wayne Hoffman made up. That's a fact. Additionally, if you go to the Attorney General's website, which again backs up the governor's order, on his fact sheet, the Attorney General says, what do I do if I see somebody violating the order? And the Attorney General suggests that you contact your local law enforcement and report them. What is that about? By the way, this is just the beginning of this. Take a look at what's taking place in other states where people with New York license plates are being followed around and folks are being questioned about whether what they're doing is considered essential or non-essential. I don't know if anyone's been arrested yet or not, but certainly law enforcement are being called and asked to sanction people in some fashion for violating the order. And we're just getting started.
Yeah, Rhode Island, I guess, was the one I read about over the weekend, where essentially turning back people who have license plates from New York State.
Yeah, I mean, no, look, if the governor were to have said, and by the way, I've been enjoying working with the governor for the last year and a half, or a little less than that, I guess. His administration is hands down way better than the previous administration. We've had a lot that we could agree on, including budgetary restraints and repealing some occupational licensure. But this completely is removed from that. And it is, if the governor had asked the populace, hey, we need you to stay home. We think that this is the best thing to do for the safety and the health of the citizens of Idaho. That's very different from an order. And I don't believe that anyone's ever been asked. They're just told. And the problem with that is not only that it's unconstitutional, but also that now you've got people who are reading this, 24 pages, trying to figure out if they're an essential business or not, and if their activities are either supportive or violative of the governor's order. That's kind of silly.
We have a couple of folks I know are looking to possibly chat with you today too, as well. You don't mind if we take some telephone calls? I think there's going to be some people who have some basic questions, and I think that you've delved into this. Your research probably is a little bit more than what most people have had an opportunity to do. And I'll just pass along the telephone number. It's a 208-736-0300. That's 208-736-0300. Do you expect we might see a court challenge at some point to this if it lasts beyond 3 weeks?
I mean, that's certainly possible, but I don't expect that that's going to turn out very much, because I think the courts are a bit complicit when it comes to this sort of thing. And people have forgotten what their constitutional rights are. They've forgotten what their natural rights are. And the courts are certainly not immune to those kinds of failings.
We've got a caller looking to join us. And caller, you're on the air with Wayne Hoffman from the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Go ahead.
Hey, I appreciate that. So my understanding is that it wasn't actually the governor who issued the legal isolation quarantine order. It was Director of Health and Welfare, and that case law says that an isolation quarantine order has to be as narrow as absolutely possible, and has to have a short defined term of isolation. Just looking for some feedback on that.
All right, thank you, caller.
Well, sure. Well, the governor issued an order, and the order is supported by the language in the order that the Department of Health and Welfare put together. So to me, the Department of Health and Welfare is a subsidiary, if you will, the executive branch, and so everything the Department of Health and Welfare does is part of a little administration. So to me, it's a distinction without a difference. The law regarding quarantines was basically written with the idea that if a person has something like smallpox or various ailments of that sort, that you could quarantine that individual, and that individual would then be isolated, and public health needs would be met by the virtue of the quarantine of that individual. This order quarantines everyone. I mean, it is so broad, it is so expansive, and it's not just the governor of Idaho, of course. You've got governments all over the country and all over the world that are acting similarly, and it's frankly a very dangerous precedent. If we go down this path and we say, okay, every time there's a public health emergency, the scope of that emergency is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and the argument's going to be made that if it just saves one life, then we ought to take this step. That means that through the remainder of human history, I suppose, when the seasonal flu comes around, or whenever some other virus is detected in the environment, public health officials.
Oh, I think we lost Wayne. We're going to try to get him back here. Phone apparently died on us. This is what you call live radio, and this does periodically happen. So let's see if we can't bring him back, and we're going to try to get him back on the line with us. And I think that might be him. Wayne, is that you?
Yeah, very sorry. There's a problem with my internet that I've been having the last week, and I haven't had time to go fix it. So I apologize for that.
That's okay. So you were right in the middle of a statement about what happens if we get cold or flu season. Would this then become precedent? And
yeah, I think this is the real problem, is that we don't exactly know. I guarantee you that at the way things are running now, every politician, and of course politicians are risk averse, there's going to be an honest-to-goodness discussion about whether they should shut down various aspects of the economy to protect society. And I think that that's terrible. Now, again, I'm not saying that people shouldn't change their behaviors if there's something going on in the health world. That's a very different question than having the government act unilaterally. And the problem with unilateral action is that it prevents people from doing good on their own in a variety of different instances. So, for example, if a business could stay open, if they could change their operating patterns in order to, because there's no business that's not essential. The non-essential businesses are all out of businesses. The horse and buggy company is out of business because they're non-essential. The telegraph company is out of business because it's non-essential. The answering machine company is out of business because it's non-essential. Everything else is essential. It's essential to the customer, it's essential to the employee, or it wouldn't exist. So the question then becomes for the businesses, and this is up to them to figure this out, and their customers, how to remain in business and how do we keep serving our clientele? But now the government's taken that right and ability away from them and said, oh no, here's our list of businesses we consider to be essential and non-essential. And it's so overreaching and so overarching that it negates everything else.
I was going to say, you brought up, you mentioned earlier when it comes to, there are people, you might quarantine them by law who might have a disease, but with people, when you don't know if they have the disease or not, this is where we get into that gray area. And I'm thinking, I think her name was Malloy. She was known as Typhoid Mary, and she had been quarantined for like the last 20 years of her life because she was working with typhus and infecting other people, but she was known to have the disease. But government, I think the law would say that government cannot go out and restrain somebody because they might have a disease. You would have to know that.
Right. And again, this is where the public figures this stuff out, where the marketplace figures things out, where people left to their own devices will figure these things. And government has no ability to do it. All it knows is force. It only knows force, making people either stay at home, making people take vaccines, making people take tests. This is what government does. But if you leave people to their own devices and allow them to figure out, sure, some people are going to screw it up, no doubt about it, but a lot of people and most people will adapt to circumstances, and the result will be way better than what we got now, where an entire economy is shut down.
I remember a bad storm that passed through the mid-Atlantic a few years ago, and it took out traffic lights. And the following day, there was a story in the Baltimore Sun newspaper, and it described how people would come up to an intersection where the lights were out, and they would simply treat it like a four-way stop. They did this on their own without anyone in government telling them to do it. There was no one there to direct traffic, and they just politely treated it that way. And I think that's where sometimes letting the public make the decisions on what they're going to do, right or wrong, they often do tend to go with what's right.
Exactly. And that's the other thing that I wanted to bring up, and I'll probably write a column about this in the future. But same thing is true with everywhere. Every time Brad Little or another governor holds a press conference, the media all shout out, what about landlords? What about renters? What about evictions? What are you doing to stop that? And the answer is very simple. I have tenants, and I say to my tenants, how are you doing on rent this month? Are you struggling? Are you getting the hours at work? And if you're not, well, can we work on that? What the government does instead is it avoids us ever having the conversation. It just says, well, it's wrong for a landlord to evict a tenant, and so therefore we're going to tell you can't do it. But isn't it better? Isn't it? I'm just asking the question, and then maybe your listeners will tell me I'm just wrong. Isn't it a better scenario where a landlord has a relationship with its client, the tenant, and says to them, look, I know you're having problems this month, but can I give you a break on your rent this month? Can I help you out? Maybe I won't charge you. But every circumstance, every tenant, every landlord is different. And landlords have different circumstances. Some landlords, the rent payment is how they make their mortgage payment, and so they can't do that. But that's an individual thing, and ultimately, the marketplace and the people in the marketplace will figure out a way to come to the right conclusion. And having some mayor or governor or county commissioner or whomever figure out the path forward for everybody because they know what's right and they know what's wrong is unfair and it's unfortunate.
I've got to get to a break, but can you stay with us another 10 minutes?
Yes, sir. Sure, certainly.
Wayne Hoffman joining us this morning from Idaho Freedom Foundation. Bill Colley with you too on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. We're at 41. It's 20 minutes after 9 o'clock. That is what we call a cold open. Wayne Hoffman is the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. He's with us a few more minutes on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley, too. We're at 41 at 9:22. And Mr. Hoffman, I was going to ask a question that popped into my mind during the course of the break. And I remember when I worked in the newsroom many, many years ago, we would call up various people in politics and say, what are you going to do about this? And I had friends who worked as public information officers, and I was told after we get about half a dozen of those calls from media, we suddenly decide we better call a news conference and have a solution ready to appease media. Now, I read over the weekend, people said the governor was not influenced by media whatsoever in this, but I have a suspicion that he was getting a lot of people calling up the office saying, what are you going to do? And that's how this came about. Would you see that as being a possibility?
I mean, it's certainly a possibility. Look, I mean, I've been in touch with the folks in the governor's office, and so, I mean, I don't want to cast aspersion on the motives. Whatever, obviously, they're under a lot of pressure. People are scared and they don't know what to do, and so they've been conditioned to turn to government. And there's no question. We do know that people like Rachel Maddow were specifically calling out, and I think you wrote about this too, were specifically calling out Brad Little, and certainly that's part of it. I don't really care what the motivation is. What I do care about is that we're living in a police state right now, where people are told to stay home. They're not allowed to go earn a living. Their natural rights are being violated. The Constitution's been thrown out the window, and it doesn't matter to me if Brad's dog told him he should do it. It's the fact that it's been done, and we're reacting in a way that is certainly violative of the very principles that I've been fighting for my whole life.
But it does seem that the temptation to be seen as doing something often overrules what you might call constitutional issues or even the future of the economy.
I mean, always, and I talk about this all the time. You know, we as everyone well knows, I think for the last 8 or so years, we've done this thing called the Idaho Freedom Index, where we look at all the different bills that go through the legislature, and we'll point out the different ways in which a bill grows government or shrinks government or perhaps violates the Constitution. And even on small things, I mean, a conservative at the drop of a hat say, well, you know, in this particular case, I want to restrain the marketplace, or I want to violate people's rights. That certainly the bill doesn't say that, but it might say something like you can't speak out about this or that or the other thing, and you decide at that moment that, yep, we're going to go ahead and do that because we got to do something. We're the government. And so, I mean, this is an extreme example of that, but every single time a question is posed to the government, you're right. Somebody feels as if they have to do something, and really the answer is the government really shouldn't do anything. The last thing the government should do, if you want health care to be run like the DMV, you know, certainly there are plenty of proposals you can put together that would make that work. But I mean, you look around. I think that if there's one constant in the universe, it's that government tends to overreact or screw things up or make life worse for people. And the last thing the government should be compelled to do or interested in doing is helping, because their help is usually bad.
And often we see these things happen, and then 6 months down the road, someone tries to do a reassessment. And I think I read a great piece by Peter Hitchens this weekend where he said, and then in the long run, they'll say, well, see what we did work. They'll find some justification to claim that that their effort, whether or not it had anything to do with the solution, that it actually worked because they took some action. And so there's never any, it doesn't seem to me that there's ever any what you call real soul searching that goes on about these decisions.
Yeah, and actually, in this particular case, it's even more diabolical because if you assume that the projections are all wrong, and that's been what's been coming out recently, you've seen a lot of articles that say, well, maybe our numbers aren't quite what we've said they are, and who knows? They'll say that, well, if not for these lockdowns, if not for the freezing of the entire economy all over the world, the numbers would have been higher. So the projections were wrong because we took action. And that's exactly what they're gonna say. The good news is that at least for right now, there are states where the government isn't shut down. Arizona and various other states that have refused to take the unilateral steps that have been taken in New York, California, Oregon, and Idaho. Those states will certainly help us maybe draw other conclusions about the effect of these kinds of orders on both health and the economy.
We got about 2 minutes to go. Any closing thoughts on this that people should keep in mind? And maybe you want to mention how they can, check out your website too as well.
Sure. We're at idahofreedom.org, and certainly you're welcome to email me, Wayne at idahofreedom.org. Everything we do is public, so there's no secrets. Any questions, we're very happy to answer. But my final thought is just that freedom does matter. The Constitution exists to protect people in exactly times like these. They weren't just meant for ordinary circumstances when the economy is rolling along, and have to have my First Amendment, my Second Amendment. You can't quarter troops in my house, but that only exists during good times. During bad times, the economy's through the everything's thrown out. The Constitution no longer exists, and suddenly if you don't have your right to assemble, if you don't have your right to travel, if you don't have your right to earn a living, how soon do you think it will be before the government comes up with excuses as to why you can't own a gun, or why you can't speak, or why you must check in with the government official every evening before you go to bed? I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg, folks. There's a lot more ice underneath the water, and if we don't react now, be very, very careful what you wish for, because if you receive it, it's going to look really, really bad, and we'll regret it for a very, very long time.
Wayne Hoffman, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for having me.
Super. Stay well, too. We're at 9:30, coming up on 9:30. Wayne Hoffman spending some time with us this morning from the Idaho Freedom Foundation on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We're at 41. Bill Colley with you for one more half hour on Magic Valley this morning. And just a reminder, your phone calls, of course, welcome. You can also reach me via our app function. If you've not yet done it, you can download our app. That's the News Radio 1310 KLIX app. You get weather updates, traffic bulletins, breaking news, and you can also message me back and forth during the course of the morning show in real time.